I've never been the kind of person who believes in ghosts. Even now, after everything, I struggle to say the word without a little self-mockery, as though admitting it out loud would make the whole experience feel less real, less serious. But what happened to me one autumn evening in Nantes, at Cimetière Miséricorde, has stayed in the corners of my mind like the smell of smoke long after the fire is gone. I had moved to Nantes in late September for work, trading the quiet, familiar streets of Limoges for something bigger, more vibrant. The city charmed me in the way old French cities always do. The winding streets around Bouffay, the Loire stretching wide and slow under the bridges, and the grand old stone buildings that seemed to remember centuries of life. I'd been there about a month when I first wandered toward Cimetière Miséricorde. The cemetery sat nestled behind old stone walls near the western edge of the city centre, not far from Place Melunay. I'd passed it a dozen times before without ever paying much attention, though the wrought iron gate and the grey stone statues always caught the corner of my eye. There was something solemn and imposing about it, even under the bright sun. It was a Sunday afternoon when I finally stepped inside. The autumn sky was pale and flat, the air crisp and dry, the streets quiet. The gate stood open, welcoming in the same passive way all cemeteries do, indifferent to the living. I told myself I was just out for a walk, curious to explore, but the moment I crossed the threshold, I felt the shift. Miséricorde isn't abandoned or overgrown. It's an active, carefully maintained cemetery, and its age shows not in decay, but in its architecture. The gravel paths curve in a careful grid, the tombs rising like rows of small houses, built from white stone and grey marble. Some are ornate, miniature chapels with stained glass windows, iron railings, and carved angels frozen in mourning. Others are simple slabs with weathered names and dates stretching back into the 19th century. At first, it was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The kind of stillness that makes you lower your voice without knowing why. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. The deeper I wandered, the more the city seemed to fade. The usual background noises, traffic, footsteps, birdsong, all seemed to melt away until the only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots. It wasn't the beauty or the history that unsettled me, though. It was the lanterns. Throughout Miséricorde, many of the graves are decorated with glass funeral lanterns, old and new. Some are small and rusted, barely able to hold a candle, while others are ornate and polished, protected behind thin panes of glass. I must have passed dozens before I noticed it, the faintest flicker of flame inside one of them. It stopped me cold. There hadn't been a breath of wind that day. The lantern wasn't new, the candle inside almost melted down to the stub, but the flame burned steady, unwavering, even though there was no one else around. My brain reached for logic. Maybe someone had lit it earlier that morning. Maybe the glass shielded it perfectly from the wind. But the longer I stood there, the more I noticed the others. More than a dozen, spread across the graves nearby, flickered softly in the grey daylight. The flames burned low but steady, as though they had only just been lit. But there was no sign of visitors. The flowers were old, the gravel undisturbed, the stones untouched. I kept walking, telling myself it was nothing. The deeper I went, the stranger the atmosphere became. The graves in the older section of the cemetery, closer to the high boundary walls, were less polished. Time had eroded the names and softened the edges of the carved faces. Even the statues of saints and angels looked worn down, their eyes hollowed by weather and age, staring blankly at nothing. I paused at one grave in particular, a family tomb surrounded by an iron fence whose gate hung open. The grave itself wasn't remarkable, a stone cross, dates worn faint, names half erased by moss. But the air around it was heavy, the scent sharp and earthy, like wet stone mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. That's when I noticed the temperature. It had dropped sharply in the last few minutes, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones regardless of your coat. The sun, which had hung steady and pale all afternoon, had vanished behind thick, sudden clouds. As I turned to head back toward the main path, the feeling arrived. The distinct sensation of being watched. Not the usual urban paranoia, but something deeper and older. The weight of eyes I couldn't see, pressing against the back of my neck. I kept walking, resisting the urge to look over my shoulder, until I heard the sound. It wasn't loud, just the soft scrape of gravel a few steps behind me. I stopped. The sound stopped. I waited, breath caught, heart hammering. When I moved again, the sound returned, always just a few paces behind. I never saw anyone. I never saw anything. But the cemetery, once peaceful and empty, now felt alive with unseen company. When I finally reached the gate, the street outside felt like another world entirely. Warm, familiar, indifferent. The tension in my shoulders only eased once I was blocks away. I didn't think much of it afterward. I told myself it was just the natural eeriness of cemeteries, the brain playing tricks on itself in the absence of sound and company. But the cemetery wasn't finished with me. That night, I woke around 3 a.m, shivering under the blanket even though the heater hummed steadily. The room felt wrong. The air was dense, heavy and cold, and the scent that lingered in the corners of the cemetery had returned, damp stone, old earth, and something faintly metallic. When I turned on the bedside lamp, my breath caught in my throat. On the windowsill sat a single tiny funeral lantern. It wasn't mine. I'd never seen it before. The wick inside was burned black, the glass smudged with faint streaks of soot, as if the flame had only just gone out. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, the lantern was gone, as if it had never been there at all. The days that followed were riddled with small, almost unnoticeable disturbances. Electronics behaving oddly, lights dimming and flickering for no apparent reason, cold drafts slithering through the apartment even when the windows were sealed, the smell of damp stone returning at odd hours, lingering just long enough to turn my stomach, and always the same time, 3:07 a.m. That was when I'd wake, heart pounding, room freezing, every hair on my body standing on end. Every time I would check the window, expecting to see that lantern sitting there again. It never was. I never went back to Cimetière Miséricorde after that. I still pass by it sometimes, walking through the streets near Place Méliné. The iron gate always seems to catch my eye, even when I try not to look. I've never worked up the nerve to step inside again. People say cemeteries are for the dead, that the living don't matter there. But I'm not so sure anymore. Some places remember you. Some places notice you the moment you cross their threshold. And once they do, I don't think they let go.